wallboard's not necessarily all that flammable, but it's component, right? So there's plenty of stuff inside the structure. So insulation. So yeah, and long-lived wood products are fantastic places for climate. There are options. That's one of the big options. You can increase the demand for tree stuff, increase the amount of carbon stored in trees in normal landscape. Super beneficial for the atmosphere. But it only happens if you consume stuff. Tell that to Brooks next time. All right, class. Yeah, Dr. Brooks.
Oh, no, he's
How
not.
are we doing?
Oh, 20 after. You guys ready to go?
All right, so this is exciting stuff today. This is the best ever. Class. This is without a doubt. I'll probably, someone's gonna fall asleep. I know it, but that's okay. This is my favorite class today. You'll know why. My hair actually will be better today. I'm so excited. Okay, so what are we talking about? Supply. There's a reason why we talk about this today, because there are so many concepts here that are super useful. And actually, this class, even though it's about the ugly, dirty oil industry, historically, a lot of lessons for us today, actually. So economically, we can learn a lot about the transitions that happened historically in the energy sector. And it tells us a lot about the transition that we're all hoping will happen in the next decade or two, right? So we can learn a lot from that, as to why it happened. And if we start thinking about how we're going to make it happen even quicker than we hope it would have happened, right? The transition we can look at some of the lessons we learned in the past. I think instruct us on that. So that's kind of what we're after. So how did the U.S. oil industry, and actually it's the world, it's not just the U.S. oil industry, this is the world oil industry. How did it begin? So there's 3 places on the map. And Ohio, that's kind of cool, right? So 3 places on the map. So one place is this, out there in Connecticut at Yale University, this guy, Professor Silliman, who proved that this black powder liquid could be refined in fractions. You create kerosene. So he invented refining, basically. All right. And what was interesting about that is that, short digression, if you were a settler in Ohio in the 1800s and you wanted to store some kind of food product over time, you didn't have refrigeration yet, how did you do that?
Build a little hut by a river.
Okay.
And put stuff in there. Let the river run underneath it.
Cool. Okay, that's one thing. What else? Yeah. How did you cure them? Salt. Where'd you get the salt? You mined it out of the ground, right? What happens when you dug down in the ground in Ohio, out eastern Ohio? What happened when you dug down in the ground? Yep. You sometimes hit coal. What else did you hit? When you're trying to find salt, basically. The reason you're digging the ground was to find salt. But what else did you find? It's not oil, all right? Oil can, so you would dig down. So literally, these people that like the first mine, actually one of the first, I think it actually is the first out of Caldwell, Ohio, the first ever oil discovery, right? I mean, by Europeans. It turns out that throughout this region, Native Americans knew about oil because there were seeps. Oil was seeping out of the ground in northwest Pennsylvania. It had been for millennia, right? So oil was around, and so what was interesting about this guy, Silliman, was he just figured out how to use it for something different, right? So they knew it was flammable, but no one knew how to control it. And what Silliman did is he showed that you could actually take this, you could heat it, and when you heated the oil up, then just like the distillation process, for those of you who might be thinking about going into refining, some kind of refining of liquids that you might consume in the future, right? When you distill things or when you heat them up, different parts of that liquid that you're heating up can be used for different things, right? At different temperatures, you get different products off of it. So one of the products was kerosene, and kerosene could be used for lighting. Right, so that was kind of novel. Why was that novel? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it was so novel at the time. You're basically killing whales and using oil for whales, right? So it was novel that you could actually dig this stuff out of the ground and create a lighting source out of it. Okay, so once you did that, then people realized, this stuff may have some purchase. We might actually be able to do something with this stuff coming out of the ground. So let's figure out a way to get it out of the ground. So this guy with Thistle, started in Pennsylvania, Rock Oil Company hires this Colonel Drake to go out there and start drilling and digging around, see if you can actually get it out of the ground commercially. And so that's what's novel is that the guy was able to get it out of the ground commercially. He was able to drill down in the ground and figure out a way to get the oil to come up out of the ground at a rate that would be useful.
Is it just a coincidence that they call them oil wells or they have that first wells?
They call oil wells, there's a Drake.
Well, is that like citing something or is that the guy's name?
That's the guy's name, Drake Well.
So it's just a coincidence?
Yeah, it's just, no, his name is Drake, Colonel Drake, and he's the guy who actually drilled the first commercial oil well.
Oh, I get it.
No, you're, sorry. So I do recommend, if anyone's got some time in their life and want to go somewhere interesting, go out there to Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania. Anyone from that area, Northwest Pennsylvania? I mean, it's kind of a cool area. What's really cool about it is that if you think back to a place where there's this massive oil find back in the 1800s and people moved in and they drilled oil. And we contain oil pretty well today now. Back then they didn't try to contain it at all. It was an environmental disaster. But today it's a pretty nice area, pretty successful ecological restoration. And they still have the original place where the Great Well was still there. And that actually is kind of cool. So after that, refineries came and started to pop up in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, sort of circle Cleveland, because that kind of became the refining center of the world for a little while, in the 1800s. So this is a real story of boom and bust. It's an interesting story. Titusville was nothing. There was practically no one there living in that region. And when they struck oil, of course, it boomed. It went like crazy, right? So it's not really a new story for us today. We think of these boom and bust cycles as happening frequently. We think about that with respect to hydraulic fracturing in eastern Ohio, northwestern Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, happening now again, sort of a boom and bust cycle. Back then, drilling was substantially more labor intensive, so it even brought in more people than we do today. This is basically census data, so every 10 years have a census. Pretty good estimate of what happened. Right, so people moved in, they started to drill the heck out of the place and increase production of oil. This whole boom and bust is critical. And Bruce, he'll talk about it with the coal sector. He'll make a really interesting point. I'm just going to make it here now because it's useful to think about it before you get to Thursday, which is that why do we have boom and bust cycles with certain sectors and don't have boom and bust cycles in other sectors? And a lot of it has to do with two things. One is inelastic demand, right? So huge price fluctuations happen when the demand function is really inelastic. But also, if the supply side is a bit inelastic as well, it can really accentuate those boom and bust cycles. And what makes the supply side inelastic is basically capital or fixed costs versus variable costs and how important each is in the production of this stuff. Well, it turns out for drilling wells like this, fixed costs are really big in the oil sector, right? So it's pretty capital intensive, and when it's capital intensive, then you only drill when prices get really high. Right? So when prices get really high, everybody goes out and drills. That creates the big boom, right? And then of course they drill. Once they've got all this oil to drill, they're extracting all this oil, and that creates the bust because then prices go down once it's sort of flooded the market supply. If capital isn't that costly, and this is what people are excited about with hydraulic fracturing, is that capital is a lot less costly with hydraulic fracturing relative to deal with oil, then maybe we can get out of this boom or bust cycle in the oil sector. Maybe, I don't know. But in any event, historically, way back when, this boom and bust cycle is a critical thing. Early on, prices for oil spiked up pretty rapidly. Huge excitement. There's another reason why we'll talk about in just a second why those prices spiked up really rapidly. The only place we knew how to extract oil from, the only place we knew where oil was located was in Pennsylvania. So for about a 20-year period between 1859 and the 1880s, really Pennsylvania was it. It was the center of the oil industry in the world. There was a big oil find in Ohio in 1885. It was up at Findlay, Ohio, and that sort of oil spike or that find happened at a good time, I guess, because we were starting to run out of supplies. This red line is quantity of supplies of oil in the U.S. And we're starting to run out in the U.S. We kind of peaked at the time. So we discovered something new, right? We went out and found oil in a different place. Then, sort of as Ohio may have been sort of petering out, we found oil in California in the 1880s. It might surprise you to find that California, despite their big emphasis on renewables today, in the 1800s was, late 1800s was a massive, it still is today, actually, there's a large amount of oil production. In fact, you can go into LA and right downtown Hollywood, and you'll find oil wells drilling oil now. They're taking oil. It's phenomenal. They're hidden, you can't see them. You have to work really hard to actually find the oil wells right down in Hollywood and places like that, but they're there. They just are so good at hiding everything out there. They hide that as well, right? Was it There Will Be Blood? It's kind of old nowadays.
Yeah, that movie's awesome.
Yes, that's a good movie, but it's basically about Upton Sinclair's novel Oil. It's basically about this sort of time period in California, and that movie was based on that book. So we'll check that out. Current Wars and There Will Be Blood, two good movies. Texas, then in 1901, Spindletop in Texas. That was the other big one. That's the biggest one in the U.S. The biggest sort of oil field, oil farm. That's when oil production really sort of ramped up in the U.S. Other things were happening at the time, as we know, but the big thing there was using oil for lighting. Right. So kind of boom and bust, but you can see as the bust happened, it was nice that we just kept finding oil in different places. Just keeps happening, right? We just keep seeming to find this stuff at any time in different places. So characteristics of the early oil industry was it was really chaotic. Oil wells were in remote places. Refining capacity was in industrial areas like Cleveland and Pittsburgh, and oil had to be delivered to refineries by railroad wooden barrels, right? So this is actually kind of interesting. It's a big reason why, early on, actually we'll find out it's a big reason why some of the antitrust regulations we have today are in place because of the connection between the oil industry and the railroad industry, which was a really tight connection. Pipelines didn't really exist until 1879. The Tidewater pipeline delivered oil from Titusville, basically East Coast, to refineries out in New Jersey. So that was a big innovation at the time that helped reduce the power of the railroads, at least in the oil industry. From that point on, it's mainly pipelines rather than railroads, although railroads have come back into fashion for delivering oil. So we need to talk about this really interesting issue of the backstop and the fact that at the end of the day, it's a fact that oil, even though it's the scourge of climate change today, it actually did save the whale, right? It actually did save the whale. So as we noted earlier on, that before oil came along, before we had to figure out how to use kerosene to create light, the way we had light was through whale oil. So basically we went out and killed whales, extracted the oil. We didn't tend to eat them here in the US. Other parts of the world, people ate whales, ate parts of whale blubber, etc. The baleen, which is the bone and the mouths of whales, was often used in women's fashion, dresses, things like that, way back in the 1800s. So the oil was the main thing that was harvested from whales, and it was really useful for industrial lubricants, for making plastics, and for light. In fact, it was the only way we had light, right? So, there was one other way we had light, tallow. So you use what? What's tallow? You know what tallow is? Yeah, it's just made from fat, right? So it's kind of like soap made from fat. Something that we use to burn. It was also used for, but it wasn't as nice as whale oil, right? Some bad smells in terms of when people burn it in their home. So people preferred whale oil. This was not a pretty industry. It was labor intensive. You guys have all read what we did there, so right? Has everyone read that? You don't have to. Maybe you haven't. any event, you know, it's not a pretty industry, but it was the biggest industry in the US for some period of time. But you know, what was happening was in the 1850s, and especially in the late 1850s, where were we on this curve? So this is production of whale oil in the US. These are prices for whale oil in the US. We were on the downside of this bell curve, right? We were on the side of this bell curve. It was getting harder and harder to find whales, right? It was getting more and more difficult to any of you anglers like to fish. No one likes to fish? What's wrong? There are fish out there. This was a big bass year, right? And we're fishing for bass this year. Unbelievable. What was that?
I was fishing a little bit.
You fish a little bit?
Yeah, fly fishing a little bit.
Fly fish? You have a good year? You have a good year?
I went once this year, good time.
Okay. But bass fishing is unbelievable. I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, you know why I call it cicadas? We beat the bass like crazy. They're enormous, huge bass this year. Anyways, you know, you realize that when things get fished out, it gets harder and harder to find fish. You have to work harder to actually find the fish, right? Because, you know, unlike trees where it's easy to go out and see where they are, so you only cut down what you can see, they're easy to find. With fish, it's a lot harder to find them, right? So you can imagine as we're starting to go down this curve, you know, the issue is it's harder and harder to find whales. People have to work harder to actually find them out there, right? So prices for whale oil were starting to go up, and as production was going down, as we were hunting them out, going off, and you know, running out, hunting to extinction, basically, right? Yep.
How did we discover how to use whale oil? in the first place?
Oh, I think probably. How do we discover anything? Probably by mistake. I have no idea, actually, but my guess is just by mistake, someone just admitted it. They decided to use it for, you know, for lighting, right? That's my guess. I don't know. Good question. All right, so whales were going extinct, and you know, this is why someone took a hunk of this stuff to sell them in the first place and figure out something to do with this. There, you know, people thought it could be used to burn oil, but it wasn't burning oil itself, wasn't going to produce light like whale oil could. So, you know, they sort of charged this person selling them with, go, you know, you're a chemist, figure out how to use this stuff for something useful. And he figured and showed out how you could use it to make light that was better than whale oil. And thank God, right? Because at the time, I guarantee you, at the time it was going on, basically we're going to go through a civil war, right? But at the same time, coming out of the Civil War was a massive period of economic growth and industrialization. If it hadn't been for, you know, figuring out that you could take oil from the ground and create light out of it, I guarantee you whales would have been lost. I guarantee you we would have been willing to pay a really high price for whale oil. It would have been a high enough price probably to make several of the species of whales go extinct. Not all of them, probably, but a lot of them. Yeah.
Honestly, like we didn't have cars at the time, but is there any correlation between like the effectiveness of trains when oil was introduced, or is oil never used to power trains?
Yeah, it is used to power, so diesel locomotives now are pretty extensive. And originally, though, they were mostly run on coal for most of those years. I don't know when the first diesel locomotives were introduced. Probably, so the internal combustion engine, which becomes a part of the story later on, right, was invented in the 1880s, 1890s. So people knew how to make those kinds of engines. However, they really didn't hit commercial scale until a couple decades later. So sometime in the early to mid, probably. Okay, so a backstop is a critical technology, critical thing to think about. And what we have to think about oil is as a backstop technology, right? So one explanation for why people invested in oil exploration is exactly the fact that price for whale oil was going really high. And it was increasing as these whales were going extinct, right? So the economist explanation for why we actually went into oil in the first place was simply because we had to. And we had to because whales were going extinct. The other alternative for both lighting, lubricants, maybe several other things were going extinct. Prices were going up, and the economy of innovation was let's start innovating and figuring out other things to do. So oil itself became sort of the cheaper alternative to that. Just some more data to see what's happening in the whale industry and the oil industry at that time. So this is kind of the same data, the prices for whale oil, and this is whale oil production, but this is oil sort of overlaid on that, right? So oil production started to come in 1859. This is oil prices, this is oil production. So prices went up, induced more, right? As prices go up, it's going to induce more people to put more capital into it. So we'll start to get an increase in production. Prices were quite different between whale oil and kerosene at the time, right? So one reason for that, what would be a reason for that? So whale lighting was still a little bit better preferred at the time. But another reason is that it was just more expensive, right? It was getting too expensive. And once this really low cost alternative came about and people could figure out how to use it, all of a sudden that became a huge driver of sort of economic growth as well, right? Okay, so what's a backstop? So a backstop, definition here. Where's my definition? Let's talk about the backstop technology. The definition. Go back to those slides for a second. So what is the definition of backstop technology? It's a new or different technology that's available at a higher price, but only becomes economically efficient when prices hit marginal cost of production for the new technology. So that's a lot of work. The point of it is that these other technologies are oftentimes out there and they're available. They're there, people know about them, but they only use them when prices get high enough that use people to use them. I think we talked about one of them, we talked about cars, right? We talked about higher efficiency cars, that is cars with better gas mileage, right? So we talked about in the 1970s in the US, we had these really inefficient old gas guzzling cars in the US, supposed to what people drove, right? And when gas prices spiked in the 1970s, it wasn't like we had to go out and invent higher and better fuel efficient cars, because it turns out the Japanese had already done that. I mean, they're an island with no gas reserves, so they had to have more fuel efficient cars, right? They had no oil of their own, so they had to get oil shipped in, and oil and gasoline was just more costly for the typical person in Japan. In 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, so they just invented better cars than that. Right? And it turns out that it was great. It was good for us that they had done that, because all of a sudden in the 1970s, when it turns out that everybody wants these fuel efficient cars, thank God they're out there, right? So everybody just switches over to them. Right? So that's another example of backstop technology. And technology that's kind of already around. It's there. It's just that we're not using it at the time because prices for gasoline for the 1970s were pretty low. We didn't need them. So when prices go up, we kind of need it. So you can think of oil kind of the same way. It was out there. People knew about it. They had some idea about it. And it wasn't until oil prices started to really go up that people started to put two and two together, and the new technology was sort of able to take off, right? It was able to take off in part because the other technology was getting too expensive. You can think about pretty much any technology you can think of kind of fits this. Right? There's a few of them that are innovative. The iPhone might be one that's not great. It seems like the iPhone that came out in 2007 was a pretty novel thing. I guess the BlackBerry had already been around. But Steve Jobs did just innovated beyond anybody else, right? So just some price, just some information. Whales are basically saved because oil production and mining technology quickly evolved. Okay, there's very little debate about that. Some people do debate it, but it seems pretty clear to me that the way, well, either two things could have happened with the U.S. economy. Right? If oil hadn't been found, it's plausible the U.S. economy never would have taken off like it did. Of course, coal was available, and that may have substituted in some way, shape, or form. Right? So, but transportation may not have ultimately taken off like it did. Or we would have just killed off all the whales just simply because incomes are rising and we still needed life, right? Yeah.
When you say U.S. economy, can you go into depth on like what that means?
Well, this was sort of the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, as in terms of economic growth, this is the period in which incomes in the US, but also in other parts of the OECD countries now, income growth has been the most dramatic over that time period, right? Before that, income growth globally has been really slow. It's been rising at 1 or 2% per year. Sort of post 1870, 1880, income growth in the developed world has risen at 4 to 5 to 6% per year. Largely due to industrialization. So we already saw sort of those prices. The other thing to think about here is at the same time, we'll come back to hit on this and have another example of probably of a backstop technology. Thomas Edison invented the incandescent light bulb at that time. Okay, and in the 1880s, Pearl Street Station. So what's that tell us? Well, what does it tell us? So this is I mean, imagine being at this time, right? And seriously, you're today. Yeah, we're thinking about changing energy production in Ohio. I don't know, we went from coal being something like 70% of electricity production, even just 6 years ago, down to something like 20% today, 30%, something like that. We'll get the number from Bruce on Thursday. So that's a pretty dramatic shift. And we're about to then flip the switch a little bit more and add in solar up to 10% of our electricity production from solar, right? Okay, so that's kind of the cool stuff we're going through. But just think about this stuff, right? So before 1859, everybody was using whales for lighting. After 1859, they're using stuff in the ground called oil. At the same time, someone invents a light bulb, right? So just think of the innovation that was going on in terms of lighting at the time. It's pretty phenomenal, right? You could take nighttime and turn it into daytime, at least inside. And these incandescent light bulbs, they weren't great back then, but nonetheless, they led to other kinds of innovations, because then all of a sudden, once you had this other kind of light bulb, you had to figure out, how do I get electricity to people's houses, right? How do I get electricity out there? And so they had to go and invent central power stations that Bruce already talked about, which the first one, the Pearl Street Station in 1882. That was the old book we used, chapter 17 of the Quest. That's a great book, actually. You should look at that. Also by Jurgen. It's a fantastic discussion of Pearl Street Station and its generation of first electricity. So again, check out that other movie currently is pretty good to look at there. So this was a time of just enormous innovation, even bigger probably than what we're seeing today, right? I mean, we need this scale of innovation if we're going to actually solve the climate problem, right? Probably. So it's kind of nice to look back at it, think about why it happened. Yeah.
So has there been like an enormous amount of whales, and there was the issue of like the rising prices and unable to find folks use like innovation practices?
I almost guarantee that switching from whale oil to other oil probably wouldn't happen this quickly if we hadn't been running out of whales. It's hard to displace the other technology, right? What you'll find in any industry, it's hard to displace a different technology, even if you're somewhat competitive, until the economics really shift in a big way. We see this so often. I mean, think about just the pandemic. That's another good example of the pandemic, right? So none of us wanted to work remotely right before the pandemic. Now everybody loves working remotely. Not everybody, but a lot of people love working remotely, right? So a lot of people switch the way they just work now, right? Especially in the service sector, not the sort of food production sector, et cetera, which still takes a lot of hands-on stuff, but a lot of other sectors where people like myself stay home all the time. But it takes a big thing like that, either a big shock or a big price shock. I think. Okay, so this backstops really have implications for lighting as well. And so this is kind of gives you a sense of differences between the different ways that we've gotten light over the years and the increase in sort of these technologies over time. This is another one, compact fluorescence. So look at this. So filament lamps, right? Everyone know what an incandescent light bulb is? Still see those as your grandparents, something like that. Right, so it's an old style light bulb. Look how inefficient it is, 14.2 lumens per watt. So that's the watts, the power that goes into it. The lumens is the amount of light that comes out of it, right? compact fluorescents have been around for a long time. We knew they were much more efficient than filament lamps, right? And LEDs were significantly more efficient as well. They've been around for a long time as well. Why did we suddenly shift over to LEDs, even though they were all available?
Because their marginal cost probably like cut down to the price of whatever the compact fluorescent was.
Okay, so why did we go to compact? Why didn't we switch over to compact fluorescents well before? I mean, look at this. This is 68 divided by 14. This is 5, something like that. Really 5 times more expensive, more lumens, right? So the cost difference could almost be 5 times, right? And still, maybe we prefer them. So why wasn't everybody switching over to these compact fluorescents? Yeah.
Where LEDs very efficient and compact fluorescents had like concerns with like the gas, I guess, or like the chemicals that they use inside of them and
Yeah, we
stuff.
didn't care about that back then. That's back in the 90s. Trust me, I was around back then. We didn't care about any of that stuff. The environment, whatever. Just kidding. We did. We did. And that was one of the issues why, but nonetheless, we still use them, right?
Mhm.
We still use them now, actually. They're the same. You know, gases, and there's mercury that is in there. It's still part of that operation. ACFL has a little bit of mercury. Which is fine if you can get it to the landfill, but if you happen to break one open on the way out there, then the mercury has the environment, yeah. LEDs aren't that way though, right? So the big reason is because we had to have some innovations in manufacturing, which I think a couple of you alluded to. That there are massive innovations in manufacturing, in LEDs in particular, in the early 2000s that allow these to really just take over the market. There's one other thing about that that's really interesting is that anyone ever heard of like these LEDs? CFL is referred to as Obama bulbs. No? Have you heard them referred to as that? And why is that? Go ahead.
Oh, no,
What's the funniest story ever? I mean, it's really hilarious. So it was 2007. I don't know, 2007, whatever it was, Energy Act. Okay, and it was a requirement that, so basically the federal government required, energy prices were going like crazy at the time, right? The federal government required that manufacturers switch over to manufacturing LEDs and compact fluorescents rather than incandescents. And they had to sort of move out of it by 2012 or something like that. Who was president in 2007 that signed that bill? History lesson for you. Bush. Yeah, George W. Bush. Who was president in 2012? Obama. Okay, so it's just funny that people call them Obama bulbs because actually it was George W. Bush's fault, right? That everybody got forced to transition over to it. Okay, so this is actually the nice lesson about this is that it wasn't just the manufacturing improvements that happened, but it was also a spur, a push by a policy, right? So it was a policy put into place by a Republican and a Republican Senate at the time as well. The House of Representatives was Democratic at the time, but they actually put in place laws that required us to switch over. And that actually potentially spurred some of the innovations in manufacturing that drove down the cost pretty dramatically. So, it turned out that, backstops are really important, but also sometimes policy can be really important in terms of spurring innovations and spurring, us to switch from sort of one kind of technology to another kind of a technology. Okay. So we had sort of oil substituting for whales and then coal substituting for oil and lighting. It's kind of interesting things. Backstop, we already talked about that. All right. So when we're thinking about the oil industry, at that time, you had these internal combustion engines starting to become, I guess, more widely used. And as we all realize, the U.S. automobile manufacturing industry grew up in Detroit, sort of led by the former Edison illuminating engineer Henry Ford. So by the 1910s, Ford makes sort of this low-cost car for the masses. So oil, when you look at those price trends, have really been declining in price for quite a period of time. Why was that? Because even though it was really useful for helping the whales out and for helping us with lighting, by the 1880s, really by early 1900s, most cities were illuminated with incandescent light bulbs. Okay, And we were using coal for producing electricity with these central power stations, and houses were being lit with light bulbs rather than oil or kerosene, at least in the US. So oil was looking for a new home. It was looking for something else to do, right? And that's when the internal combustion engine came along, and Ford figured out a way to manufacture cars relatively cheaply, so more people could get access to them. And that sort of provided a new demand for oil. It really dramatically drove up the quantity of oil that we consume. So you can kind of look along the price series for oil historically, and the amount of oil that's produced in the US and globally in terms of oil, and see lots of these points in history that are kind of interesting in those graphics, right? So, really high prices for oil in real terms when oil is displacing whales, right? It makes sense. It's a new technology. You're just figuring it out. Price for lighting is really high. Imagine why there'd be a high price for oil. The prices start to come down. You really kind of get to low levels in the 1800s, in part because we're starting to figure out these incandescent light bulbs and move away pretty quickly from oil as a lighting source to incandescent light bulbs, right? Some high economic growth during this time period that drove prices up for oil, but for the most part, prices were pretty low, okay? Then all of a sudden, we start to figure out how to produce oil and turn it into gasoline that can be used in cars, and prices go up again. It's the same time we're doing what? Right, we're discovering oil in Texas and start to really extract the heck out of it there, right? So it's kind of interesting to see how all these things go together. For much of this time, the 1920s, all the way up to the 1960s, it's pretty clear that the pace of discovery of oil around the world was much higher than the pace of demand. So prices just kept going down over this time period until the 1970s, when prices spiked up. And that's when we really started to look at fuel efficiency, right? Okay, so fascinating to look at those things. Now, the more important thing, I think the more important lesson that I learned is sort of the Gilded Age. I don't know what the Gilded Age is. Was that better or worse than now?
For who you're talking about?
Well, who is it better for?
Like, those really wealthy.
Rich people?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it depends on like what, if you're just talking about the Gilded Age and not like the
Are we
Depression.
living in a Gilded Age now?
It depends on how you define that. Like, because I guess you could say that we are, yeah, like living standards are so high in terms of rising. Inequality is also rising as well. I guess it's, but I guess we could call it that. I guess, but compared to like the late 1800s, early 1900s, like everything's been a Gilded Age essentially, except for like the Depression and like war periods.
So it's fascinating. Okay, so this is good. So if you look at the data, that period, even though it was a long time ago, it looks almost exactly like now, in the sense that that was a period of massive wealth creation in the US and around the world. And the amount of wealth created was created largely in the hands of really wealthy people. So we have massive increase in disparity of wealth, right? A lot more really rich people, and well, not that many more rich people. That is, wealth was concentrated in the hands of a lot fewer people. If you ever read this book by Thomas Piketty, right, which is, I think it was 2013, basically, he drew some nice comparisons between way back then and the last couple decades. And the sad part of that is that what reverses that kind of wealth correction? Well, what reversed it in the 20th century was the depression and 2 wars, right? 2 big wars. That's what actually dissipates the differences in wealth between them. So that's an interesting book to read because it kind of creates some question marks for us, is that we're worried about the differences in wealth we have now, which is obviously pretty large because of amazingly wealthy people out there, and a lot of other people who are really left behind. You have to ask the question, how are we going to change that, right? The only way we did it before was through some techniques that weren't so helpful. Anyways, this post-Civil War era was immense wealth creation. Industrialization was going through pretty much every sector. Pretty phenomenal stuff. A disproportionate number of wealthy people historically come from that era. Rockefeller, Carnegie, et cetera, right? The Standard Oil Company, yeah,
Wasn't there also measures to like break up the monopolies like that?
Yeah. Yep, early 1900s, fine, so one of the results of this era, as we'll talk about, was antitrust regulation, which was first put in place in the 1870s, but wasn't actually used until the 1990s. And was used, in fact, to break up the Standard Oil Company. So, you know, if you've ever seen what's the best ever slogan for the state of Ohio? The heart of it all, right? You guys have seen that one? I'm not that old. It's the heart of it, right? Isn't that great? You guys still live in the heart of it all? It's awesome, right? So Ohio was at the heart of the oil industry, right? The Standard Oil Company, centered here in Ohio. John D. Rockefeller from the mistake on the way, right? From Cleveland, Ohio. So it was incorporated in 1870 in Ohio. You know, if you want to understand the oil industry, actually, it's not just the oil industry. If you want to understand pretty much all of industry, understanding something about the Standard Oil Company is pretty useful. So the Standard Oil Company was incorporated in 1870 in Ohio. John D. Rockefeller, he had like a CVS, right? Back at the time, so a corner drugstore. And he just heard about this oil thing, got together with another person and decided to, buy a refinery. So he bought a refinery, started refining oil, and ultimately, I guess he had a vision bigger than anyone else's. He decided to buy out his partners, so we had the whole thing. And what's phenomenal about that is within a decade, they basically became the biggest company in the history of the world. To this day, it's still one of the top 10 companies. Up until about 5 years ago, it was still the #1 company in terms of size, right? And they actually ended up controlling 90% of refining and distribution. Never really controlled a lot of the actual oil itself in the ground. But control what happened a lot, pretty phenomenal. And he's just still a pretty wealthy person. So this is kind of where they rank. Apple's on top now. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, just the last 45 years. Standard Oil, if you were to take their market value when they were dissolved in 1911 as a result of the Supreme Court ruling, there's something worth $1 trillion today, right? So ExxonMobil, which actually is one of the ones that was, well, two of them that was dissolved from Standard Oil, is not so big anymore. But even as of 5 or 6 years ago, would have been in this list. Okay. Okay, so why the Standard Oil Company? So the reason, so how did a company like this get started? And what was it that Rockefeller saw that other people didn't? So he looked at this inelasticity in this market. So I mean, this is, it's visionaries, right? At the time, super visionary. Turns out the guy was hated later. But we can at least look back and say, well, what worked? What kinds of things did he see that allowed him to push this market forward? Well, he looked out and said, it's a huge problem. This free market, this capitalism market is really creating problems because we've got massive fluctuations in price, we've got big overproduction from time to time, big underproduction from time to time, huge price swings. We're trying to transport oil from here to there. We have all kinds of losses along the way, difficulties of getting it from here to there. Overcapacity in refineries. So he was in the refining business originally, and he recognized I've got a lot of competition. It kind of sucks, man. These people are really giving me low margins, so I'm not making enough money. And then, how do you suppose they got the name, the Standard Oil Company? Yeah.
It says unusual dangerous product quality, so I imagine it was like, at least like, you can rely on us to have like a standard of like quality and not like.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Exactly right. So there was huge problems back in the day with this stuff. This was flammable liquid. It could explode, right? And they had trouble, refining it to, at the time, they didn't have the same kinds of quality controls that we have today. These refineries would have unequal type of product. So you could get, one type of kerosene could work great. The next type of kerosene wouldn't work so well. They tried playing around with it to get it to light, and all of a sudden blow your entire house up. Happened a lot, actually. So, that was where they got the idea for the name was, they were McDonald's before McDonald's, right? Let's figure out a way to standardize the quality of our product. We sell people our products in every standard, right? We'll just call it that. And that'll, create a market niche for us that's different than everybody else, and it actually worked, right? So he looked at this and said, there's lots of problems. I want to figure out a way how to solve these problems. Okay. So he went around and said, let's solve them. How do I solve most of these problems? What would you do to solve them? What would you do to solve
Get like your own processes for all of these.
them? Yeah, take over the whole dang thing, right?
Yeah.
So each of these are problems at different stages of production, right? From pulling it out of the ground, transporting it, refining it, marketing it, et cetera, et cetera. So he just decided, what we need to do is be in charge of every one of these points where something is happening that's important, right? Or where it could create some kind of a price fluctuation or capital fluctuation or a production fluctuation that could affect the industry. But if we can get control of all that, then we can solve this problem that is sort of plaguing this industry, right? And we just call that vertical integration. Okay? I don't think you originally thought about being a monopolist at the time, ended up being a monopolist. I think originally it was just, let's vertically integrate. Let's, from getting the oil out of the ground to the time it hits the consumer, let's create one company that can take care of all these sort of problems of, sort of the ones that are listed. Right? So that was an innovation. People hadn't done that in the past. Most of the big companies at the time were not vertically integrated. They're massive railroad companies. That wasn't vertically integrated, it was just a railroad company. Massive steel company, but it was just a steel company. They didn't produce the cars as well, right? For the trains, for other things. They just produced the steel. They didn't dig the coal out of the ground, et cetera, right? So this was a novel concept, and obviously they worked pretty hard at it. You should read about this because it's from Cleveland, Ohio. They call it the Cleveland Massacre, right? Isn't that exciting? It's a whole massacre named after Cleveland. Isn't that the best? There's no Cincinnati massacre. Yay, go Cincinnati. Or at least nice, but it's about something just about how Rockefeller took over nearly all of his competitors. This is probably the most interesting story in all of business. Well, probably not. It is kind of interesting. And it's the best part about it is the roots of Rockefeller's destruction, i.e. the loss of the monopoly in 1911, were actually built into this. Okay, because what you didn't know is at the time when how does massacre work was, what Rockefeller wanted to do was take over the refining business. So you need to get all its competitors out of there. So what did he do? He went and made a deal with the train companies, right? So Vanderbilt, he said, look, what I want to do is get all these guys out. If I can get all these guys out, then I can run the refining business, and then I can give you kickbacks. You'll make more money, and I'll make more money. So in order to do this, what we have to do is set two different prices. One price for me to get my oil from the oil country up to the refineries, and a separate price for everybody else, right? Just got to get you to go along with it. So he basically did that, and he used this thing called the South Improvement Company, which is a shell company, to go and just create havoc down in oil country. He drove some people out of business, and one of those people he drove out of business turns out to be the person who ultimately essentially took him down, which is kind of fascinating. Took her a while, but she did it. Okay, so after they were able to buy up all the other refineries, essentially what they did is they just choked the other refineries with oil supply, right? And when the other refineries had no oil supply, Rockefeller came in and said, "Okay, we'll buy up your refineries. You have no way to keep profit." Right? So we ended up over a one Saturday night of taking over the entire, basically, refining business in Cleveland at the time, and then across the rest of the U.S. after that. So after that, he was able to get good pricing from the railroads, including rebates for his oil, and drawbacks on oil shipped by competitors. So everybody else was paying a much higher price to ship their oil than he was. Pipelines came along, they could have driven this out of, they could have driven, gotten rid of this monopoly power that he had, because they would have been able to ship oil further to the east, where Rockefeller didn't own the refineries. But ultimately, he was able to actually get control of the pipelines as well, which is kind of phenomenal, right? Okay, so this is vertical integration. This is what he was after. Really interesting job. systems vertically integrated from the oil extraction area all the way to the consumers. So vertical integration is a useful concept to have. Sort of, we find it in lots of areas of the energy industry. The industry is a lot less vertically integrated today, but the oil industry is extremely vertically integrated. Electricity industry, not so much. Natural gas industry is pretty closely linked to the oil industry, so someone is. Solar does not seem to be vertically integrated at the moment. Maybe heading that way, I'm not really sure. But the wind power industry is definitely not vertically integrated. So this is really kind of specific to the oil industry. Who else is trying to vertically integrate today?
Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus is doing this like crazy, right? I mean, pretty soon we'll actually own all the trees and make some boxes, for sure, right? Fascinating. Okay. So, vertical integration monopoly. So, once he was able to sort of vertically integrate, he decided that it wasn't just enough to vertically integrate, but it'd be nice to control the price as well. Right? And control the price strategy, and that's what we call monopoly. And so, this monopoly issue became a big issue, and you see the concern or something. I like that sort of small stuff. I think I like about the Atlantic. It's been around for like 150 years, right? It's pretty interesting. Magazine, those of you who like to read magazines or still read magazines, I highly recommend it. But the most interesting person is Ida Tarpel, right? So if you can think of journalists and the most famous journalists you know, this is probably the most famous journalist you don't know. Right? So I recommend all of you go out to learn something about Ida Tarpel. So she worked for McClure's magazine, and so what really pissed her off was that in that Cleveland massacre, her father was part of the oil industry in Titusville, Pennsylvania, driven out of business, driven to bankruptcy, lost all his money, et cetera, right? And so she spent her entire career working to sort of fix that. She didn't like Rockefeller, and so she went after it. And she did, by all rights, a pretty good job of it by sort of publishing this thing called The History of Standard Oil, of the Standard Oil Company, and exposing most of these practices, which a lot of people thought weren't so good, right? Most fair-minded people would just say, "This is just monopoly. People shouldn't be allowed to do this." And she was actually so good at it and so good at reporting. She was during that time period able to get the ear of the President Roosevelt at the time, who became very interested in ways to push forward with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which I think of it passed in 1879, and use it to actually take down companies like the Standard Oil Company. So in 1909, the federal government sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So this is also maybe ironic, I have no idea. Was Roosevelt president in 1909? Who's president in 1909? Yeah, Howard Taft, right? He's from Cincinnati. Right? It's beautiful. It's the best part of that. This is the Cincinnati guy takes out the Cleveland guy. It's awesome. All right, so William Howard Taft decided to go ahead and sue the Standard Oil Company, not so much for the vertical integration, but because they had price control, right? Because they were able to control prices, because they were a monopoly by the definition of monopoly set out in the Sherman Antitrust Law, because they controlled a high percentage of the market. And in 1911, they won. It's really the biggest case that was ever won under the Sherman Antitrust Law. Other cases that were won as well. So the Standard Oil Company was broken into 32 separate pieces. What is ironic about that, I think it exists today, is that even though I think that something like the Sherman Antitrust Act is a good thing, there was a lot of evidence at the time Standard Oil's monopoly power was already starting to wane. It was starting to wane because of international competition. So it turns out that there were, Shell Oil, what became British Petroleum, a number of other countries, and other companies in the world were actually starting to do as good a job as Standard Oil at producing oil and distributing oil and refining it, et cetera. There was significant amount of competition, and even within the U.S. there was competition. So there's evidence that their competitive power was starting to wane. So even though the federal government jumped in there with the antitrust suit and won the suit, it's not obvious that they would have been able to continue on with as much monopoly power as they had at the time. I think that's true in most cases. When you think of Microsoft, the government won a suit against Microsoft, right? But it was at the same time that Apple was just coming back into action, right? Steve Jobs left Apple when they came back and started getting better computers again than Microsoft. It was about the time that the federal government won their suit against Microsoft. So Microsoft started to get other kinds of competition that was, that was worthy of competing with them. AT&T, AT&T was a telephone company for many, many years in the US. They used landlines. Well, they lost their suit, got broken up into like 15 different companies around the US. And it was about the same time that cell phones started to come into business, right? So I don't know, it's interesting to think about this Sherman antitrust and just how effective it is, because there's a lot of evidence that usually by the time the government gets around to doing it, some other competitive pressures force monopolists sort of to change, usually some kind of technological change. Yeah.
You mentioned that there was more. Is that one where Marathon started?
No, Marathon. So Marathon, it turns out, is one of the standard oil companies. So it was broken off into 33 separate entities. The big ones were these seven sisters, 7 oil companies. 2 of them were centered in Ohio, Standard Oil of Ohio, and the Ohio Oil Company. So Marathon is the Ohio Oil Company, part of. But of course, I don't know who got that oil deal, whether it was Sohngen or the Ohio Oil Company got the oil for so today, Standard of Indiana, Standard of Ohio are part of British Petroleum. They were part of our back in the 1980s and 1990s. The reason why Ohio became part of British Petroleum was they had overextended themselves trying to get oil out of Alaska. Amoco had overextended themselves trying to get oil out of Russia. Chevron, of course, Chevron today, that basically Standard Oil of California. ExxonMobil was, Exxon back then, the Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York. So it's fascinating, those companies are still with us today, right? And those are basically 4 of the biggest oil companies in the world. So it's kind of interesting, they're still around. These things never disappear. Maybe they'll disappear with climate change, I don't know.
So when they broke them up, how does that process work? They just like assign like. These are yours now.
So yeah, so the Supreme Court in their order, I don't know how much detail they go into in terms of breaking them up. They probably say you have to break them up into these sized assets, right? And then they probably leave it up to the company then to figure out how to do that, whether it's regionally or some other way. They didn't do that with Microsoft. What they did with Microsoft is they required Microsoft to unbundle stuff, so they didn't try to break Microsoft into the Seattle Computer Company and whoever else. What they did is they required to unbundle the internet. It was the internet thing, Internet Explorer at the time. So that when you bought a computer, you didn't have to buy also all this stuff from Microsoft at the same time. So it's a different kind of rule in that case. AT&T, they did it recently. So they broke up AT&T. They said you have to break it up into X number of entities. You decide how to do that. So that's my understanding of it. Okay, so in the 1990s and 2000s, a lot of these things came back together. So Exxon and Mobil were separate companies. They merged together. So it's Amoco and Sohngen BP sort of merged together. Chevron and Texaco merged together. So there were lots of mergers. And at the time, those mergers happened because there were these massive projects that everybody conceived of needing to do. So it's so this is just ironic as well, right? That that for a long time, it was about breaking them apart. But by the time we got to the 1990s and 2000s, these companies were starting to sort of come back together again, right? Why were they doing that? Well, because the competition globally was, for these companies, it was for the state-owned, their competition with the state-owned oil companies, right? So Saudi Aramco, people who have really low-cost oil supplies that we talked about in Saudi Arabia, were a massive competitor. They had much more capital than any of these individual companies. So the individual company said, well, if I get together with another individual company, then I can have a bigger capital pot, and I can maybe take on some of the big projects that, say, Saudi Aramco. And so there are reasons why these super majors started to get back together, and you started to see, think we're heading back into directions like we saw back in the early 1900s, that was massive oil companies with less competition. But what's going on today? It's not happening. What's the best part is the current situation is like nirvana. So we now got to the point where what? Oil shares have fallen substantially in recent years. Why is this? This is kind of fun, actually. And so the pandemic was one part, but that wasn't the fun part. The fun part is the other two. So investor confidence started to fall, right? So investors started to worry about really climate change. They started to worry about companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron, et cetera, maybe being in the same position that some of the cigarette companies have been in a couple decades before. That is, understanding some of the science, but then not so, it's okay to produce oil, if you acknowledge the science, right? What's probably not okay is to actively create separate inaccurate science and try to hold that up as actual science, right? Which there seems to be, and that's what the cigarette companies for sure did, right? At least there's lots of court documents that show that they did. And there's starting to be more information to suggest that companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron have potentially been involved in the same kinds of activities, right? And actively promoting, science that wasn't so accurate in order to make it seem like, potentially oil wasn't a potential cause of, say, climate change. Yeah.
If anyone's interested in this, at the end of October, Congress is actually going to be investigating Exxon and BP and having them answer for spreading false science about climate.
Yeah.
Have you seen the documentary Merchants of Doubt?
I have not.
So it's about exactly what you're saying. It talks about how businesses will intentionally create doubt about science to promote certain products. Like they talk about the cigarette industry and they talk about fossil fuel companies. And it's a really cool documentary about it. But
Merchants of Doubt.
Merchants of Doubt, yeah, I watched it for free on the internet. Just Googled it. It's available to anybody who wants to watch it.
Well, it's free. It can't be true. Just.
It's good. It's a good one.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So what were investors worried about? So investors are worried about what? They're worried about their assets, right? So they're worried about Exxon investing $3 billion in a new oil well, only to find out that that oil well is actually worth about $1 billion in returns in the future, right? Because the oil price is falling, and because maybe they're under lawsuit potential from the federal government or something like that, right? So investors were really getting concerned about the possibility that companies like ExxonMobil were seriously overstating the value of their assets, specifically the value of the oil that they had in the ground, right? And so share prices fell pretty dramatically. Now, a big reason they fell was really because of the pandemic, but there was also some element of concern about how these oil companies have potentially overstated their asset value, ignored potential climate damages associated with those asset values, and potentially would be involved in some lawsuits that looked a lot like the lawsuits that occurred with not just with the cigarette companies, but also, I guess, with the most recently the opioid companies. That's a similar kind of thing. Okay, so, and even more exciting in May, so there are 3 things in May that happened just this year, which is really phenomenal, is Exxon tried to keep 2 environmentalists from getting on the board of directors, but it turns out that the hedge funds, the big hedge funds, which are really in ESG investing, forced them to put them on there. So they won the vote, right? These are elections where, people can get on the board of directors if they get enough people who are shareholders to vote for them. And the two environmentalists got on the board. Chevron investors asked the company to cut GHG emissions, including scope 3. You know what scope 3 is? So scope 3 is outside the boundaries of the company. So it includes you and I driving around on Chevron gasoline. Right? So this is a pretty phenomenal thing. So the actual investors put a resolution that got voted on by the board of directors or by the shareholders that won. That said the Chevron has to, in the next by 2030, cut, I forget the number is, but to cut their actual emissions by X amount, as well as the scope 3 ones, which are you and I driving around, which is just phenomenal. And then a Dutch court ordered Shell to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. So these three things have really, we're really flipped around. In the 1990s and 2000s, the oil companies, everybody was excited about let's get bigger and bigger and bigger, just extract more stuff. And today it's really flipped around. Yeah.
How would they be able to cut scope 3 emissions?
That's a great question. So we'll talk about that later as well, especially as we get into the climate change section. So now the big thing is counting GHG emissions per gallon of gasoline, basically. So we'll look at measuring that. And we'll look at different oil sources around the world. You can stack them up from high. So the tar sands we talked about, those are really high greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions per gallon of oil, the gasoline produced, all the way down to basically, I think the lowest one is a certain field in Saudi Arabia, the lowest GHG emissions. So you're going to want to get your oil down to this. You would cut it like if most of their supplying stuff in way up here, you get it down here. Right? You can do carbon capture and storage. So if in the refining process, if you can capture the carbon from the refining process, you can reduce the emissions of that oil, and that's how it would count in scope 3.
Yeah.
It's a hard task. It's a big task. Yeah.
Did the courts disclose the consequences if they didn't reach the 45%?
For Dutch, for the Shell oil case, I have to go read the video now. I don't know.
Like what happens if they just don't? Another fine.
Presumably they would be able to do that. So the reason it's the Dutch court is the Shell is a Dutch company. And so presumably they would have some members like that who could institute a fine.
But those fines are very minimal compared to the size of the company.
You're thinking of the US. I don't know what the European context. I just feel that. But there's also the fact that consumers can get really upset at it, right? And create a problem for the consumers worse than they are. So that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but that's a good question. I'll see if I can find more. They may not know what they can do to this one. It's still not even a dog. Yeah.
All right, I have 2 questions. When you say greenhouse gas emissions, are they actually specifying that it's just like, are they asked to quantify every different greenhouse gas or
Yes.
like, okay, and so they just have to like cut their like total greenhouse gases, like it's not one specific one.
Well, I think it would be all of it.
Okay, so, jumping off of that, natural gas produces methane.
Correct.
And so everyone's talking about how great natural gas is because it doesn't have any CO2 emissions, but methane is like over 30 times more potent than CO2.
That's correct.
And so I don't know how much methane is being produced in the natural gas industry relative to like those, 30 times or whatever. But if we're just like, there's a difference between like, everyone has to cut your CO2 emissions versus cutting your greenhouse gas emissions. So do you see in the future natural gas having to cut their methane? Like, I guess I just wonder.
So you can start to see ways that they can cut this stuff. Because so if Chevron has a lot of natural gas operations. And if they can, so in some cases where they're producing oil and they don't have natural gas collection ability, they can't collect the natural gas, they flare it off, right? They burn the natural gas, which is better than emitting the methane. right? So for the atmosphere. But, you can start to see one way that maybe it'll reduce their emissions, rather than clearing the stuff off, they can actually build a pipeline system to collect it. Right? So that's how, they're gonna start to cut their emissions, is by figuring out economic ways to start to, at the margin, rather than flaring off the natural gas, collect it and sell it.
How
Right?
does flaring off the gas, you said it reduces the methane?
Yeah, so methane is roughly 298 times more carbon, whatever, or 30 times more carbon intensive, right? Than carbon dioxide. So by burning the natural gas, you convert the natural gas to carbon dioxide, so it's less damaging to the atmosphere.
Oh, so, okay, so it converts the methane.
So, you can start to see ways that they can do this. Right? Not easy, but you start to see ways they can do it.
Yeah, the point about the Dutch court, this may be a dumb question, but is this like Shell has to reduce emissions in Netherlands or? just all
No,
over?
well, they can implement that.
So I'm from the Netherlands. I'm born there and just came here for college. And it's a really good question because none of the reports actually stated what the consequences would be for Shell. And so in May, they announced this report, but Shell's like really busy appealing and everything. So I'm not even sure 2030 is gonna be a deadline. I can even, I don't know, with all the appeals, what they're gonna do with that.
That's correct, so. But also, the European Union, of which the Netherlands is a part, right, has announced 2050 goal will be carbon neutral within the European Union. Right, so my understanding is, you can tell me this is wrong, is that this applies to Shell globally. This, but the 2050 EU carbon neutral thing, which would be even more than 45% reduction, or 100% reduction, basically, that applies just to the EU. So in any event, well, it's a court order. My guess is it's kind of going to be irrelevant by 2030, because if the EU rules are in place that they have to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, I'm going to guess that it would pretty far along towards this by 2030. That's just my guess. I don't know. But anyways, well, if you could find any more information on that, report back to us, that'd be awesome. Tell us if they're going to give them a big
I
time.
will.
If they can reduce your taxes, can they reduce your taxes, right? We all want, yeah.
How do we know if, I guess we don't know, but like, what are your thoughts on like whether the EU is actually going to like keep their promise? Because again, like, you're gonna have new administrations and like new people in the EU.
Yeah.
And they can just kind of like keep extending that deadline. Like I see in my community, there's like a sustainable community in 2050. And first of all, I'm like, what does that even mean, like sustainable community? And then second of all, like, you just have different governments that keep coming in and like erasing what other people did. And like, there's no like sustainable by 2050 or else this, like, and they could just be like, oh, forgot about what we said 2050, like now it's 2070, like. I don't know.
That's correct, but, yeah, the point is good that, there's no, but with the EU, they actually will have directives in place and legal requirements for it. I don't think the US is gonna get to that point of legal requirements, so. Now, having said that, if you look at, so back when we had the Kyoto Protocol, which was in 1997, which was an internationally binding legal requirement for everybody but the US. The US was closer to meeting the Kyoto Protocol than any European country, like 2012, actually. So, it's always interesting to know and to sort of look at where these things play out at the end of the day. Sometimes having regulations doesn't actually get you any closer.
When
Right?
I heard about the Paris Agreement, like you were already on track, you didn't need to like, aim off it. That's what I heard.
But that's the Paris Agreement with Trump. That's the one where, Trump took the US name off of it. And you just have to ask the question, why would you do that? It's not costing us anything. It's not, you don't have to do anything. You just sit with it and ignore it. But he decided to take the name off of it, take the stir out of it for whatever reason. That benefited him politically, I guess, right? But it's just kind of weird, right? Anyways, well, that's it for the day, you know. There you go, in a nutshell, oil issue, awesome. We can study and learn from it. Not just more oil, right? Okay, so Thursday, Bruce will be back, quick announcement on the homework, I'm gonna wait one more day for someone to turn in their homework before I put the solution up there, I'll get the solution up there tomorrow. Okay, so that's just to help someone else out, kind of like you do the last person with the thing. And once I put the solution up, I can't actually, you know, give a person. So bear with me on that. I'll get the solution up tomorrow. But yeah, just like, you know, remember that if you're trying to get from one plane to another, you end up at the airport late. Okay. Thursday, homework's due on the evening, all right?
You talking about the solution to the first one?
Yeah.
Okay.